So I'm going to start with prayer, and it's going to be a bit different because I want to pray about something political, namely the vote going through, hopefully not going through this afternoon. So I hope you're happy to join with me in that. I wouldn't normally pray so overtly a political prayer, but I feel that the matters that will follow this afternoon are some of the most momentous in my lifetime, and I want to pray for one particular result. So I hope you'll join me in that. Lord, we come before you urgently, asking for your help and your mercy on our country. And we do want to pray against any move towards assisted dying or humans killing other humans. And we recognise that we've turned astray from you so much as a country, and we just pray for your kindness and your grace to be shown in a defeat, and that this idea would be put away, and that the vulnerable would be spared. Lord, please hear our prayer. Amen. Thank you. And you may want to pray about that over lunchtime. It's votes just up early afternoon, I think so. Okay, let's get back to Luke chapter 15. Jesus has got two audiences, people who don't know the Bible and people who do. And I think that most of this story is aimed towards those who don't know the Bible. And that's also part of how things are orientated in the New Testament, that the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost. And those who are well don't need a doctor, as he says elsewhere. And it's not that they are actually well, it's just that they think they're well. And Jesus comes for the brokenhearted. Therefore, there may be some logic to the fact that the story about the lost sheep is slightly longer than the story about the lost coin. There may be some logic to why the finishing phrase on the story of the lost sheep is a little bit more explicit than the one after the lost coin. Actually, you've got the more than. I mean, admittedly, it'd be less climactic to say at the end of the lost coin, there's more joy over one sinner who repents than over 9 coins, that lost. That wouldn't quite work. So Jesus has the phrases perfect. What I want to argue, though, is that Jesus actually has lots of reference to the Old Testament in here. A man had 2 sons, is the way the story begins. Now, if you've heard me give this talk at all, don't answer the question. But if I want to hear from any who haven't read the book, what might that trigger in your mind? A man had 2 sons, if you're thinking about the Bible. Jacob and Esau, that's right. So Isaac is the most famous person to have 2 and only 2 sons in the Bible. And of course, he has the older son Esau and the younger son Jacob. Now, Jacob tricks Esau out of his inheritance, okay? As a result, Esau, the older brother, is flaming mad, so therefore Jacob has to go off into a far country. And in that far country, he feeds animals, he's there away for many years. After many years, he comes back, and then you have this very striking phrase where he comes back, because he hears that Esau is coming towards him with 400 armed men. And so in Genesis 32, we get the story about how he splits up his family to make sure that Esau doesn't get to splat them all. Then what happens is it says, Genesis 33 verse 4, and it's the only time it occurs in all the Bible, it says, but Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, fell on his neck and kissed him. It's the only time in the Bible someone runs, falls on someone's neck and kisses them, is when the older brother is welcoming the younger brother back from a far country. But in this case, the older brother had been cheated out of absolutely everything. And the older brother, as we learn elsewhere, Esau is quite a bad guy. He's not a sort of normally a biblical saint. But Jesus takes that bit of the story, and if you're a scribe, you can't really miss that, because I'll show you some pictures later if we get rigged up, because there are actually part of the scribal training was that you had to put dots over particular words, and we actually managed to get these dots onto the cover of the book, because there are 15 places in the Bible that you have to do that. In fact, I probably will rig up a computer just to get you some picture of this. Is it best to use mine or yours?
Yours, because we don't have one here.
Because you don't have one. So that's really simple. You've got a Mac adapter, yeah?
We can do, yeah.
Actually, otherwise we use my dodgy Mac adapter. It sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Sorry about that. One of the things I want to show you is that this is actually part of the scribal training of the time. Now, I think I'm already on the remote Wi-Fi from the previous slide. Yes, I am. Good. So I'm going to get up a website and we're going to show you this so you can understand exactly what my argument is. The older brother, let's see.
USB-C.
Or just anything will go to that.
There's an HDMI behind you.
HDMI, okay, excellent. So hopefully this will have to start. You turn it on, and then we can start with Google. So you can do this yourselves, I think.
Let's go.
Let's think about it. Let's go back to Jesus' story. When the younger brother comes back, the older brother is potentially annoyed because younger brother is going to be living off his own money. Okay, so you can see how the older brother feels annoyed. Now, is that annoyance justified? Think about it. The younger brother's had his share of the inheritance. Let's say it's 1/3, we don't know. And older brother's got lots. So the older brother's not short of stuff at all. He's got loads. Does it really matter if little brother has a small amount? Shouldn't do. But he feels really annoyed about that. But also, there's the other side of, we know, potentially, that the younger brother is actually a worker. Because in his speech, although he never actually finished that speech, delivering it to dad, he is actually prepared to be an extra worker on the farm. So you've got the question that Jesus never solves, which is the younger brother a scrounger or is he another worker? And you can see how the older brother's going to read that as he's just a burden, whereas in fact there's the possibility that he's not. Now let's get look at this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a Google on Puncta Extraordinaria. And we're going to look that up. Puncta Extraordinaria, Wikipedia, nothing like it.
Can you spell that for us, for those who don't have the...
Okay, can you see that?
Yeah. Yes, I can.
Okay. So extraordinary points are small dots in the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible, where they appear alongside more common points. So you get the idea. You've got Hebrew here, and Hebrew normally has dots. Let's make those a bit bigger. Okay, normally dots. But every now and then, you get an extra special dot. Okay, that's just one. You wouldn't necessarily know that. But the point is, there are 10 of these in all the Torah. Okay, 10 of these. And when we look at where they are, let's just zoom out. One of the things you can see is one of them is Genesis 19 verse, 33 verse 4, which is that verse about the running, embracing, and kissing him. And it's this word kiss which gets 6 extra dots. Now these are medieval dots, but I think we've got lots of historical arguments that they go back to the time of Jesus. Okay, and one of the arguments is that there are references to these dots even in the Mishnah, and though some dots occur in the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are cancellation dots. So you don't want to draw a line across them like we do nowadays. That's messy. So what you do is, if there's a textual debate about whether Jacob actually kissed Esau or not, So let's say one manuscript doesn't have kiss, one does, okay? Now, how does Jesus solve that textual debate? He has the word kiss in his story, just like we do in our Bibles are just fine. But scribes don't want to mess around and adjudicate between this and that. That's not their job. Their job is to pass on what they receive, okay? So how do they do that? They pass on the word, but they're signaling that somewhere along the tradition, some manuscript somewhere missed out that word, okay? And so in order to do that, they put these 6 dots over it. But that seems to be part of the scribal training of Jesus' day. And there are only 15 points in the entire Bible where they have these. See, most of them in Genesis, some elsewhere, okay? Think about it. He's talking to scribes. He makes the high point, dramatic high point of his story, something that they are specifically trained to do, to know about that verse. Ran, embraced, kissed. In fact, you can even imagine scribes having a debate back and forth. Or did he actually kiss him in Genesis? In other words, it's something that's been part of their consciousness at quite a high level. And that is the amazing thing, that one of the amazing things that Jesus does in this story is to do that. So that's just a man had 2 sons, but of course there's more. Because who in the Bible says, I'm dying of hunger? Esau, the older brother. So those words are now transferred to the younger brother in Jesus' story. When does Esau say he's dying of hunger? Immediately before he gets tricked out of his inheritance. Okay, so it's all related to that. And of course, what happens is, in the story of Jacob and Esau is angry at his loss, at the loss of his inheritance, and then he overcomes that anger and kisses, right? Whereas what we see in the arc of Jesus' story, often things are turned on their head, is the older brother wins his inheritance, not loses, wins his inheritance, does exactly the opposite, and moves in an arc towards anger. So it's exactly the opposite. And so often we find in Jesus' stories, that's fine, that we get this sort of reversal going on. But there are other links with the Jacob and Esau story, because, of course, when is the only time anyone eats young goats in the Bible? Isaac, yes. Remember that Rebecca overhears that Isaac's going to bless, and so off goes Esau on a hunt. She gets gets Jacob to get 2 young goats. She prepares it. Then what happens is Jacob puts on the robes, not just the clothes of Esau, the robes of Esau. And then he draws near, and he's got his goat skin to do all the tricking with. Now, if you're a scribe, maybe we'll get some more stuff up. Has anyone here done some Hebrew? That's good. Okay, we'll do a bit of Hebrew. I like the Step Bible, which is some software that began out of Tyndale House. Anyone know about Step Bible? Anyone use it? Great. Yeah, excellent. Oh yeah, you're going to get my... Oh, it's great having tech help. Good, okay. It's the wrong screen. We're going to have to make that smaller. Oh man. See, this is where my eyesight's going to fail me on this, but okay, we're just going to do a bit of moving so I can actually type in there. We're going to go to Step Bible, stepbible.org, get up a Bible, and obviously I was reading Amos recently, and we don't need the Arabic there, so we'll get rid of that. Okay, and we're going to go. Okay, now there we've got Hebrew, and let's make the fonts bigger, which is, well, actually, let's get to the right passage first. So, this is where we change the font size. This is free Bible software, by the way, everyone. So if you don't use this, you should. Make the Hebrew bigger, make the English a lot bigger.
Okay, is that big enough? Okay. Right. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to Genesis. There must be a better way of doing this, but no. Okay. We're going to go to Genesis 26 anyway. Genesis 26. And there you've got the story of Isaac and what happens with him. And then he digs these wells. And then we're going to go on to exchange ghosts. And then we're going to go to Genesis 27, of course. Okay, prepare me some delicious food. Now, you've got the young goats there. And then what we see is that he's got the young goats on his hand, skin, and then what we're going to see is that he comes to his father, and then his father says, please come near. Okay, now I'm going to highlight that word near, okay? Because what you can see is that word occurs an awful lot in this passage. Here, here, here. In fact, if you're a scribe, there's no way you come across the word come near as often as in this passage. He came near and kissed him. Come near and all this sort of thing. So if you're thinking about the words near and far in Jesus' story, then even that could trigger some reference to this. All these years I've been slaving for you. Who says that in the Bible? Jacob to Laban. Remember, all 20 years I've been working for you. This is how much I work for your daughters. So what you find is various bits of the sort of Jacob, Laban, Jacob and Esau story are triggered by this all these years. Just going to give you some more. Jacob goes out with nothing and comes back with great wealth. This son goes out with a lot and comes back with nothing. Esau comes in from the field saying he's dying from hunger, younger son dying of hunger. Isaac really wants meat. Who really wants meat in Jesus' story? It's the older brother. Oh, you never gave me the young goat that I could have. And so all of those sorts of things are potential links that you have with this story. Then we find, if we go over to the story of Jacob and Laban, not only does Jacob get angry with his father-in-law and say, all these years I've been working for you, but also we find that the father-in-law, Laban, who's caught up with him, said, oh, I wanted to send you off with music and dancing. It's the same sort of phrase that you get in Jesus's story, or with mirth and songs. So there's lots of links there. But let's have another go at this. A man had two sons. What does that remind you of in the Bible, other than Jacob and Esau?
Ishmael and Isaac.
Sorry?
Ishmael and Isaac.
Ishmael and Isaac, yeah. So Abraham has Ishmael and Isaac. Now, of course he has some more sons later. But this is where we need to look at Genesis chapter 18. Because if you're a scribe, you know that the very first time anyone runs in the Bible is Genesis chapter 18. Who's the first person to run? It's Abraham. And, he's an old man at the time when he runs. He's 99. So you think they might have spotted that there's a 99-year-old running. And what happens in Genesis chapter 18 is you get this. I'm going to read the first few verses, starting with verse 1. The Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent at the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked. Behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I found favour in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So he says, a little bit of water, little bit of bread. Okay, that's what he's offering. So they said, do as you've said, and Abraham went quickly into the tent
and said to Sarah and said, first word, quick. That's first person to say quick in the Bible, okay, is Abraham. 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, first calf in the Bible, okay, as well as this is the Bible's first home cooking. I mean, obviously, Melchizedek did a food delivery service, that's different, earlier. Tender and good, and gave it to you, young man, who prepared it quickly, and they took curds and milk and the calf they had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. And a seah, it's saying in my Bible, is 7.3 litres. So 3 of those, we're talking about 22 litres of flour and a calf for 3 guys. Okay, so Abraham's not eating this, he's standing, they are eating. So he is a really good host. So, when the writer to the Hebrews says some people have entertained angels unaware, just remember, Abraham is the best possible host, and that's why God's no man's debtor. He makes him in charge of the heavenly feast, and that's why you see him feasting chapter Luke 13 and Luke 16 and so on. So that's all part of the context that Abraham is the archetypal father figure in the Bible. It's even in his name, Abraham, father of nations. Okay, and he entertains complete strangers, runs, says quick, puts on a big feast with a calf. So again, if you're a scribe, how can you miss all of those clues? First time you write the word run, first time you write the word quick, father, calf, it's all there. A man had 2 sons, but what does Abraham do as in his inheritance? Genesis 25. Let's go Genesis 25. You see, this is where we see that he doesn't give his inheritance to his 2 sons. He gives it just to 1 son. So, Genesis chapter 25, verse 5. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. So think about this. Abraham gives everything to the younger of these 2 sons. Ishmael gets nothing. He has some more sons later from Keturah, and he sends them all away. Oh, but this is the same Abraham who would not let his son Isaac go into a far country. So whereas the father in Jesus' story lets the son go off into a far country, Abraham wouldn't do that. He lets the others go to a far country. In fact, they have to. And you've got that contrast. That's why you've got all of Genesis 24, massively long chapter, about the servant going and getting Rebekah from a far country. Why, though, does Abraham not give the inheritance to both Ishmael and Isaac? Well, the answer to that is in Genesis chapter 21. Genesis chapter 21, we read about the feast given for the younger brother. Chapter 21, verse 8. And the child, Isaac, grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out the slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Or whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Now, I admit these are some difficult passages. What you've got is a funny thing where Abraham is listening to the voice of his wife, because it's so funny the way it's picked up in the New Testament that Sarah is portrayed as the woman who obeyed her husband, right? But of course, also in the narrative in Genesis, Abraham obeys his wife. And God says that's the right thing to do in this situation. What's going on is Ishmael loses his inheritance through despising the feast for the younger brother. Now, if you're a scribe, think about what that might mean for you. Jesus is eating with scribes, tax collectors and sinners. They're like the younger brother. They're people who you might say seem to be going astray. And the scribes and Pharisees are despising that. They're despising the thought that these people could get access to God through Jesus the Rabbi. They don't want that at all. But what happens if you despise the feast for a younger brother? You could lose your inheritance. Think about that. You're a rule keeper, a Pharisee, a scribe. You're not going astray. You're spending all your time, close to the things of the temple, following the things of God. You are the heirs, and you're saying, look, how can it be that I was about to donate to the temple last week? That tax collector over there took my donation, gave it to Rome Incorporated, and now you're saying he can get a shortcut to God, to access God? That's outrageous, isn't it? He needs to, be outside, I'm on the inside. And Jesus is saying, you despise God's acceptance of them, you actually risk your own inheritance. And this is a deeply challenging thing to us as we think about church, because church needs to be orientated towards the outsider. Now, do the scribes and Pharisees have to hear all of the references Jesus is making? No, they don't. Because remember the last phrase in chapter 14, that the one Isaiah is saying here. One of the things you can do is, well, I sometimes do, that's what I'm trying to multitask, is you actually don't take in anything. You're not very distracted, you're not very paying much attention. You might think, well, Jesus is a bit of a bumpkin, you're not listening that attentively, and you miss it all. Even though if you concentrated and applied yourself, you might be able to hear it. But then there's a question like, scribe come to judgment day, and you see that the genius is being in front of him, whether or not he's seen it. And so one of the things I think that's going on in this story is that Jesus is portraying his genius for those who have ears to hear. They can see it. All the evidence is there. Now, the great thing is the story works without any of knowing these layers about meaning from the Old Testament. And I don't want anyone to go away from today and think, oh, the real meaning of the story is the layers I'm going to show you. I don't want people to do that. If anything, it's like that's an added extra for the scribes. Jesus' heart with the story, the 62%, the focus is on the younger son. Okay, I really want us to go away with that. Not just the 62%, but also the two choruses you get at the two division points in this story about are the father making a statement about the younger son. One saying why he has to celebrate, and the other saying why the older brother has to celebrate. Okay, and everyone. So I want people to go away with that heart I think Jesus has for the outsider. But here we have something where he says, a man had two sons, and how can it not remind you of Abraham? A man had two sons. What else might it remind you of? Anyone else have two sons? Adam. Yeah, now think about that. Adam has, of course, some more sons later, but he is the case of the Bible's first family conflict, right? Genesis chapter 4. And that's the story of an older brother who's connected with the field, who is angry at the acceptance of his younger brother, who's associated with herding animals. And then there's this conversation between God, like a father figure, and the older brother. Now, it's only a tentative set of connections, let's say. I mean, one thing Tim Keller talks about in his book, The Prodigal God, is the likeness of the Cain and Abel narrative. But is it just a coincidence that the very first sort of family narrative we have in the entire Bible fits the structure of this story? So I'd argue that what we've got is we've got the story of Adam, we've got the story of Abraham, we've got the story of Isaac, we've got the story of Jacob and Laban. Where does someone suddenly get a ring and a robe in the Bible? Joseph. Where do we get a great famine in the Bible? Yeah? Where do we have a son who his father thought was dead and alive again in the Bible?
Joseph. Yeah? So it's quite striking that when Joseph comes before Pharaoh, Genesis 41, verse 42, it says, then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him with garments, fine linen, with a gold chain around his neck. It's not identical, but it is the only time, again, you get a ring and a robe like that. There's some stuff going on with Mordecai as well that we could maybe think about. But it's quite striking that we have that. So does that cover all of Genesis's hits? Okay, well, let's think of one more. You never gave me a young goat, so I could celebrate my friend, but when this son of yours, who devoured your livelihood with prostitutes, came and killed the fattened calf for him. Where in the Bible do we get friend, goat, and prostitute? Those three.
Oh, Judah.
Judah. Okay. Genesis 38. So remember the X-rated passage, Genesis 38? And it's worth looking at Genesis 38 because this is where Judah, from whom the Jews derive their name, is sexually misbehaving in the land while his little brother Joseph is sexually behaving in a far country resisting Mrs. Potiphar. Now remember that the story has never specified the sins of the younger brother. He just wasted his money living riotously. As far as the older brother is concerned, it's the main expense of being prostitutes. Okay, and what we find in Genesis 38 is that you get this bit where it says Judah sends the young goat. This is Genesis 38 verse 20 by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand. He did not find her. He asked the men at the place, where is the cult prostitute who was at Ainaim at the roadside? And they said, no cult prostitute has been here. So he returned to Judah and said, I've not found her. The men of the place said, no cult prostitute has been here. And Judah replied, I love this bit. Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. Well, they get laughed at anyway. So, he doesn't quite realise his words are going down in history. But 2 verses in Jesus' story, friend, goat, prostitute. 2 verses in Genesis 38, friend, goat, prostitute. Again, it's hard not to see the link. So what Jesus has done is he's basically taken a 4-hour narrative, which is Genesis, and all of the greatest narrative hits are wound into a 3-minute story, such that if you don't know the Bible, the story completely works. The story can go to any country and it works as a basic core archetypal story, deeply emotional, and at the same time, it works at a deeper level if you do know the Bible. And yet there's no clunkiness in it. There's no sort of artificiality to how a reference has been slipped in. It's very smooth. In fact, Jesus even adapts a number of the references so they look a bit different. They're smooth within their own context. That to me is real genius, because to take a 3-minute story and expand it to a 4-hour book would be far easier. So if we didn't know that Genesis came before Luke, okay, like we knew nothing about archaeology or biblical history, you would be tempted to think that the Luke 15 story came first and Genesis just expands the different strands that there are. But to be able to condense so much of Genesis into that story, such that there are quite a number of striking references as well as some sort of debatable references, and that's a key thing I want to get across. That's a really interesting thing to do. So for me, there are some indisputable references. First man, only man in the entire Bible to give away his inheritance while he's still alive. The only one is Abraham. The first man in the Bible to run, and he's an old man and he says, quick, and there's a calf, is Abraham. Ring in a row, that's Joseph. Dead and alive again. Great famine, that's Joseph. All these years I've been enslaved with you, that's Jacob and Laban. Run, embrace, kiss, that's Jacob and Esau. All of those things are really striking, and there are lots of references that are less striking. But of course, a good storyteller has an edge, and you're not quite sure where it is. So what we see is it's quite a challenging sort of story in terms of what it's getting across, and we see the combination of EQ, emotional intelligence, plus IQ. He knows what the scribes are studying. He must know the text of Genesis very well.
in order to tell this story, and he's able to switch, emotions on and off, and he's able to teach two groups together. And that, to me, is part of what just makes this an absolutely fantastic story. But there are more things to say, because, of course, you can't get this sort of story, I believe, by committing. So one of the things that I want to argue is that it all has to go back to Jesus. Because what you can't say is, well, he began with a sort of core of the story, and then people expanded. Because then they wouldn't necessarily have the traits that would be there in the original. It's the fact that you have this consistent leaning on the book of Genesis, which I think is so striking. Now, of course, there are things beyond Genesis, like Exodus. Who says, I've sinned against heaven and before you? Well, the closest phrase we can get to that is Pharaoh's insincere repentance, where we have, I'm going to look at my book, but it's Genesis 9, get those exact reference, so I might be able to find where it is. He says, I've sinned against God and you, and then he sort of backs off his repentance. Someone can find it. Now, the interesting thing about that is it makes me slightly doubt the sincerity of the younger son's repentance. So is the younger son truly repentant or not? And Jesus slightly casts a shadow on that, because it actually doesn't matter whether he's repentant or not in terms of what you're supposed to do as the older brother. If you're the older brother, if you're on the inside, if you're, connected with the people of God, you're allowed to have questions in your mind about the younger son's attitude. That doesn't mean, shouldn't change how you accept them. Have you found it?
9:27, is it?
9:27, thank you.
It's not exactly what you're saying, but I think that's what it's implying.
I have sinned, the Lord is right, and my people are wrong. There's one even closer than that.
Exodus 10,
10,
verse 16.
10:16. Thank you, I've sinned against the Lord your God and against you. That's the closest phrase in the Bible. It's not an identical match again. So just, if you're thinking about that, it causes a slight question mark in your mind about the repentance. Where in the Bible do we get music and a calf and anger?
Exodus.
Yeah. Moses, the lawgiver, coming down and people are breaking the law. There's calf and there's music. Bad, okay? So you're a scribe, you're a Pharisee, you are really angry about anyone breaking the law. Oh, you are so full of righteous anger. And of course, this story portrays the older brother who's in the wrong as that person who's full of anger. So this all does have to go back to Jesus. Now, there's a bit more we can say, which doesn't come from the biblical text, because it's not just that there is a layer of Old Testament references, there's also a layer of rabbinic references as well. So this has to go to someone who knows rabbinic stories. Lots of rabbinic stories have a 99 and a 1, but there is a story about how did Moses get his job. Now, rabbis tell parables, but none of them tell as many parables as Jesus, and no rabbi is associated with parables in the way that Jesus is. There's a parable, and these have been handed down in late Hebrew manuscripts, but they're definitely, the Jews haven't been getting their stories from Christians, okay? So we know that's sort of an independent, even though the manuscripts are late, that the stories must be old. There's a story about how Moses got his job, and part of it was leading the people. Well, he found a sheep. He found the sheep that was lost, and God said, "Oh, that's good. You're doing the right sort of thing. You can be in charge of my people, who are like sheep." Okay, so that warm-up story is quite an interesting thing in terms of thinking, well, okay, I'm going to be like Moses. But there's another story, and that's a story about a lost coin. It's one coin that is lost by a man. Okay. And the man loses the coin. It's an obol, it's the coin. And losing the coin, it says, is like losing the law. Okay, that's what it is in the rabbinic parable. That's what the coin stands for. So what Jesus is, again, setting his scribal audience to think about is, we should be like Moses, finding the sheep that's lost. But also, you are like people who have lost the law. And also that means it doesn't come from Luke, because Luke's not a rabbi. So it's not, the work of art has to come from one mind, Jesus. Well, let's say one mind, one artist right the way through, who knows rabbinic stuff and knows the Old Testament and knows has got high IQ and EQ. Now, I'm not saying Luke doesn't have that, but I think Jesus fits the bill better, and we're going to see a little bit more reason to say it all comes from Jesus. I've been speaking quite a bit. Are there any questions yet at this point? Yeah.
Thank you. This is fascinating. I wonder if, thinking of Genesis and Exodus, and especially the God kind of sort of divine parentage theme in Genesis, and then into Exodus, and thinking of Israel being, I think the first entity in the Bible is called God's sons.
Yep.
In Exodus 4. And do you think that there could be, in thinking of Luke's overarching narrative of kind of Luke Acts, sort of Gentile mission being the end result of that, do you think there could also be Jesus playing even at that meta level theme of kind of Israel in a sense being?
So certainly N.T. Wright, who I think comes here regularly, thinks of this in those sort of terms. I'm not sure. I mean, I need to. Yeah.
And it's interesting because I could see Israel, the case to be made playing either one of the sons.
That's part of the problem. Does Israel have to be both of the sons? Simultaneously. For that, yeah.
But it would be interesting to play on the theme of idolatry. He has ears to hear, let him hear. And one of the themes of idolatry in the Old Testament is those who worship idols become like them, having eyes they do not see and ears they do not hear.
Yeah.
So it could be, anyway, it's just interesting. I wonder what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, probably not thought enough. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
This is more from the previous session, but I thought about, the father's very generous by giving them their inheritance. The older brother basically has everything.
Yeah.
But then it seems that the father's very generous with the older brother's money.
Yeah, sure.
Later on, so it's sort of like.
Yeah, so one of the things you could do is feel sorry for the older brother. I mean, does anyone ever read 1 Samuel and feel a bit sorry for Saul? God just happens to come or Samuel just happens to come just after he's sacrificed, almost as if he's like waiting and do it. So I think that the father is uncomfortably generous. Okay, so it's not part of the culture to give away your inheritance while you're still alive, and you wonder, why is no one told the older brother this celebration is on? And why is he the last one to hear? Well, of course, he's been working in the field and he's been in a far field. You can imagine this. Again, it's not something that Jesus says. That could be why, but it does seem, odd. But then there can be this thing that because you're not, it's like Matthew 25 with the sheep and the goats. The sheep are accepted if they happen to have done one thing right ever, and the goats are rejected if they happen to have done one thing wrong ever. Right? I'm slightly exaggerating it, but well, no, maybe I'm not. It's a pretty strong statement. So the point is that because we all deserve God's condemnation, no one deserves any of God's grace at all. But here we have people who are, scribes and Pharisees, right at the centre of knowledge about God. They've heard things so many times, and despite that, they're feeling all disgruntled. That's surely wrong. So I feel that it's not that the two sons are treated necessarily equally. It never talks in those sort of terms. The point is that the father is generous to both. And the father had given the older brother, I assume, the majority of the stuff up front. So you can't really question the father's generosity. There's a legal background to it where you can say the father is allowed to give out orders and kill a fattened calf because he is still head of the house. He just simply cannot dispose of the capital. That's all, so that, as I understand it, is the best we can reconstruct the legal background. Now, of course, it is a story, so it's always difficult to know which legal system we're supposed to imagine this going under, but you have to sort of work into what would be the legal system that the hearers would imagine to get that, and that seems to be most plausible. But yes, the father is uncomfortably generous. You have this question of whose is the robe, and it never answers that question. But I think if we go away with a sense of feeling pity for the older brother rather than compassion for the younger brother, we're actually getting the wrong end of the story. But maybe the story allows us to do that. Maybe the story actually tempts us to do that, if I can put it like that.
It makes me think of when Saul's annoyed that Jonathan gives his armour to David.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the robe might have connections there.
Yeah. I mean,
it's not a robe.
It's a very interesting thing the way. So David ends up at the beginning of 1 Samuel 18 looking like the king's son. That's the key thing. He's got the armour and so on. And it does seem, yes, it's an amazing reversal as God's favour has gone away from Saul towards David. I'm trying to work out, wrestle live with the question of what Jesus is trying to achieve with the story. But I do think that you can get false trails, if that makes sense. And so you could go away from the story with a sense of sympathy towards the older brother rather than the sense of what you're supposed to have, which is the challenge as the older brother. To swallow your pride. Yes, you've been insulted. I mean, you could say, oh, look, I've been insulted. No one called me to the party. I'm being fed off. That calf belongs to me. There's a whole party. There's all sorts of reasons for feeling disgruntled, and that's wrong. You should feel, wow, this son was dead and alive again. He's lost this. Your brother was dead and alive again. So, in a sense, where the father at the end focuses the older brother's mind on what actually matters.
And you said it early on at the beginning that the older brother should be thrilled about the younger brother because he got his inheritance sooner.
Yeah.
So
his little brother got
if you
him
can
that
talk, then yeah.
So in
He should be happy.
the longer story, he should be really happy. And
Yeah.
the little slight that he didn't get invited to the party. I mean, just grow up. That's not the really big deal. Is your presumably one and only brother is back. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about it more from a relational perspective when the father says to the son, all that I have almost is yours.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, the son who's in the presence of the father should be like the father.
Yeah.
So rather than what the father is expecting is that what he's given the son. It's like the father giving Jesus everything. The father is giving his son everything. And the son is expected to be behaving in the same manner, the love, the compassion that the father has. Yeah. And that's what the father wants, and that's what he expects. Obviously, the older son has got something different in his mind. But that I think is in some way or another is that the father is expecting that even if he says something to do and the son doesn't want to let him do it, the father still can do what he wants to do because he's expecting the son is wanting the same thing. And he's be surprised that the son will be saying, you did this to my brother and you didn't do this to me. It's from that concept of how that dynamic of the relationship between father and son who is near you is expected to be played out.
That's right. I want to go to Jesus' shortest story now, and then we'll come back to the longest one. So this is let's go to Matthew chapter 13, verse 33. We might start just before then. So I'm going to land up on verse 33, but I want to start at verse 31. So we've got two stories here. He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, that a man took and sowed in his field. It's smaller than all the seeds, but when it's grown, it's larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till all was leavened. Now, the interesting thing here is we have a pair, a male character and then a female character, okay? The man and the woman in verse 31 and verse 33. And they are each taking something small that becomes bigger, okay? So in one case it's a mustard seed, in the other it's leaven that grows. And then they each have an allusion to the Old Testament. So in the case of the parable of the mustard seed, we find that the birds of the air come and nest in it. And that is a reference to the book of Daniel, where you get that happening with the birds of heaven. And then you find that there's this story of the woman. Where have we had that before? Where's the first home entertainment in the Bible? Genesis 18. Abraham runs, says quick, no verb. What's he say to Sarah? 3 measures of flour, 3 seahs of flour. And the point is, this word seah is the same word. So it's a Greek word, sarton, transliterating a Hebrew word, se'ah, but it's a vocab match between Genesis 18 and Matthew 13. And it's number 3. The word seah occurs about 6 times in the Bible and the Old Testament, always with a different number other than 3. But it's first occurrence. The first time we get seah, the first time we get home baking, the first time we get flour is there, right? All of that is in the same verse that Jesus refers to in his longest story. Quick, he takes for his longest story. 3 seahs, he takes a flour, he takes for his shortest story. Then we get the calf back in his longest story. So in other words, we can make a case that it's Jesus' mind that's thinking about this particular verse, Genesis 18, verse 6. So it's all part of the argument that this doesn't come from Luke. And if you say it comes from Luke, now that story about the leaven is in Matthew and in Luke. Then you have to have it beginning in Luke and somehow making its way over to Matthew. There are some people who have the idea that Luke came first and Matthew copied that. It's pretty rare, but there are some nowadays because people are getting bored of all the other permutations on the relationship between the Gospels, and so people are trying that one out. But that won't explain other fact patterns we're finding. Firstly, Jesus is the only rabbi we know of who tells parables back to back. Look at Mark chapter 4 or Matthew chapter 13, you get story back to back. Matthew chapter 25, stories back to back. Luke 15, stories back to back. But they're different stories. So you can't say that Luke got the idea of having stories back to back. Well, you'd have to have him sort of decide to imitate that idea from another gospel and then come up with the stories, right? It becomes really, really complicated relative to just saying, Jesus told stories back to back. Or the fact that you have in many of Jesus' stories where you have a male character followed by a female character, that's exactly what we have going on in not only this passage, but also we've got a few other examples. Matthew 12, you've got about the men of Nineveh rising up in judgment, followed by the queen of the south, the queen of Sheba. In Matthew chapter 24, you get 2 men in one field, one will be taken the other left. 2 women will be grinding at a mill, one will be taken the other left. It's very common. That's the same pairing we have at the beginning of Luke chapter 15. It's a way Jesus speaks. There are other features of the way Jesus speaks, which clearly link this to him. One of them is the way you talk to a father. Oh, let's start with a man had 2 sons. Who says a man had 2 sons? Elsewhere, Jesus. Look over at Matthew chapter 21. Matthew chapter 21, verse 28, and we find this story. 21, verse 28. What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, "Son, go and work in the vineyard today." And he answered, "I will not." But afterward he changed his mind and went. And he went to the other son and he said the same. And he answered, "I go, sir." But he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father? They said the first. Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, tax collectors and prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you." Now, a man had 2 sons. Jesus begins stories in 2 different Gospels there, and those 2 stories don't feature in any other Gospels. So this one is only in Matthew, the one we've been looking at in Luke 15 is only in Luke. So there isn't really an easy way to say one got copied into the other, but they have the same sort of structure. In each case, there's sons contrasting. In each case, it's about tax collectors and sinners, and sort of the same idea, if you like, behind them, the same mind. One looks really good at first, but turns out to be less good. The other one looks worse and then turns out to do the right thing. But notice also that they answer. One says no, effectively, and then goes. The other one said, "I go, sir," with that extra word. In other words, this storyteller, the storyteller who tells the story in Matthew 21, pays attention to how people address figures, whether that's in or out. Now, it's a different thing from what's going on in Luke 15, because there you've got father, 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 and look, the missing word, without the word father. But you see the same mindset is the storyteller paying attention to how a character in his story addresses someone. So all of this comes together to make me think, wow, this is all part of the genius of the storyteller. That makes sense. So let's go on to back to Luke, but we're going to head on into Luke 16. I think we've got time. Yeah, good. Luke 16, I want us to look at some of the genius we have here and how it relates. Luke 16, he said to his disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought against him that this man was wasting his possessions." Okay, so it's 2 parables in a row about people who waste possessions. And he called him and said to him, "What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do? Since my master is taking the management away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig, I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I'm removed from management, people may receive me into their houses." So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" He said, 100 measures of oil. And my footnote doesn't tell you, it should be 100 baths of oil is the word in the Greek, which is a Hebrew word. And he said to him, "Take your bill, sit down and write, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, "How much do you owe?" He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness, but the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. One who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? If you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were until John. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. It's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. Everyone who divorces his wife and then marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery." That looks completely random in the context, but isn't. Moving on. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. He called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. Besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, send him to my father's house, where I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. So part of my argument is going to be Luke 15 and 16 have loads and loads of connections, okay? And they all need to come from the same person. But when you build up the profile of who that person is, it fits better the person of Jesus than the person of Luke. We're already seeing some of that with the fact that we've got connections over, say, in Matthew's gospel with what's being said. So one of those elements is that there are rabbinic elements behind Luke 15. The next thing I want to look at is the fact that there are local measurement elements in Luke 16. So what we have there is we have some liquids and some solids, okay, oil and wheat, and they are measured by baths and cors. Now, the thing about that is different countries in the Roman Empire had different ways of measuring things. They hadn't harmonized all their measuring systems. That doesn't happen really quickly. So these are Old Testament labels. That clearly works for someone telling the story who comes from that land, okay? But also we can say that when you're using a phrase like unrighteous wealth, and you might have a footnote or something that says something like mammon, that's an Aramaic word. So there's that mammon of unrighteousness is a specific sort of phrase from the land of Jesus. It's a phrase we can find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, wealth of unrighteousness. And also the phrase, he talks about the children of light. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a phrase called, there's a book called The Battle of the Children of Light and the War Scrolls, between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. So in other words, it's using 5 different phrases: mammon, wealth of unrighteousness, Bath, Kor, and children of light, all of which, as far as we know, are just for that land. Okay, so that's already quite striking. But then, remember, there are links between chapter 15 and 16. Both of them are about wasters, both of these stories. Both of them have the man addressing himself and with a question and then resolving on a course of action. Then what is the course of action? Both of them involve a command, quick, okay? Sit down quickly. And both of them involve a question, how much or how many? It's exactly the same phrase. How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough? Or how much do you owe? It's the same question word there in Greek. In fact, there's a Greek phrase which, when the older brother comes in from the field and calls one of the lads, the Greek is pros kalisamenos hena, calling one. That exact phrase is repeated in chapter 16, where he calls each one of the debtors. So in other words, you've got clearly the same mind going behind all of these different phrases. Take your bill, sit down, and write 50. But there's a bit more. We saw with this shortest story of Jesus the story of the woman getting the 3 measures. And this is an amazing story because when you think about Matthew 13:33, we're pretty underwhelmed. The kingdom of heaven is like a woman putting leaven into 3 measures of flour and takes all that. I think, well, okay, I can't really preach on that. Yes, you can. It's the most amazing story ever because who's the first woman to do, cooking, home entertainment in the Bible? It's Sarah. And at the time, she has no physical or spiritual children. None at all, right? And the kingdom of heaven grows from that to a point where she's going to have more physical and spiritual children than she can count. So you begin with your Bible's first flower, your first seers, and the woman, and you think, how can that not be Sarah? How can you not be reminded of Sarah in that story? So Jesus, however, gives a twist to the story. Because you remember, in the story in Genesis, it's unleavened bread. Because the absolutely essential thing is getting this on the table as fast as possible for your 3. Yes. What Jesus does is say, we're going to allow this bread some time to rise. And the kingdom of heaven just allows time for things just to keep on rising. And that's all the difference between the unleavened bread and the leavened bread. And the leavened bread is far better. I don't know about you, but I always going to choose leavened bread if I can. So that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. So you can now, one of the things that we see in that is Jesus is taking a number from an Old Testament story and putting it into his story. That also happens here. When you have the figures, what happens is he has so many baths of oil and so many baths and so many cores of wheat. Those figures don't come from nowhere. They come from Ezra chapter 7, verse 22. Jesus doesn't just pick numbers from nowhere. He actually picks them out of the Old Testament. And he does that in the parable of the unforgiving servant. Remember how the parable of the unforgiving servant has one servant who owes the king 10,000 talents. Is there someone in the Old Testament who owes the king 10,000 talents? Sure. That's Haman, right? Haman says to the king, I'll pay 10,000 talents into your treasury, which is an absolutely massive figure. What then happens to Haman is Haman ends up falling down in front of the king, in front of Esther as well. Jesus takes that 10,000 and the falling down, puts that into the story of the unforgiving servant. Because remember, Haman is trying to take it out on the junior servant, namely Mordecai, who's associated with the gate of the king. And in fact, their fates are reversed by the end. So that all of that stuff, the numbers in Jesus' stories often come from the Old Testament. So again, that's all part of showing it's the same mind. So we've got time for a slight, quick bit of questions, and then we're going to have to dive into Luke 16 after lunch. Yeah.
Can I just try to go back to the 2 brothers?
Yeah.
And then I think, although when I think about the first son, although the father gave all the inheritance, I don't know that much details, so it's like I try to think in my Oriental mind, Asian mind. So, so even you given by your father and said, yeah, my firstborn, the first one, yeah, your brother's gone, but all is mine, legally yours. But as a brother's perspective, as Asian mind, thinking until he passed away, it cannot be mine. It could be taken away, and then he might say something. Yeah. His brother come there, I've been split, so it's not really mine, because that's against the relationship we have with parents. Yeah. Especially your father. And then so to my mind, that I wonder whether the way he inheritance, although his father confirmed that all I have is yours, but in his mind, until you passed away, it's not mine really. Yeah. It looks like in the paper, but it's I know morally if I do take in charge of it, and everyone in my society gonna think that I'm a bad son. But in that case, that's why I have to go to slave myself to get affirmation from father that I'm actually good enough to really. Yeah. So I'm not. To me, I feel that he hasn't got the faith in inheritance, confidence in inheritance. So he think that he had to work to gain the inheritance. So that's why he ended up saying things like what he said.
I think that's beautifully put. I mean, my brother's married a Chinese girl, her parents gave them a flat in London. Gave. Yeah. I mean, it's like, yeah, but they can't just get rid of it. It's not given like that. So yes, it's definitely a sort of socially qualified giving. And I think, yeah, your perspective is very helpful because effectively, yes, this older brother, he feels like a slave. He's treating himself like a slave, even though he is really a son and really an heir. And I think that's part of the challenge to us, as believers, to recognise God's promises to us and not to think of him as this hard taskmaster who's trying to make us work as slaves. Yeah, Michael.
Peter, you've powerfully showed us that Jesus is the master storyteller. You've also said that not a word of his was wasted. What would be your take on what is often said, that most of the discourses given in the Bible are actually a summary of a longer speech? And if so, what part does Luke play in all of this?
Right, we might need to come back to that after lunch when I set up the chat. Maybe we'll start off on that. So I think the Lesson on the Mount, often called the Sermon on the Mount, I see as a précis. I don't think that everyone gathered together from miles around and Jesus said, I'm just going to do you 12 minutes and that's it, right? And when it says he went up on the mountain and he taught them, saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, he actually taught them, which means repeat after me, potentially. So some people won't worry, like, how can it be that the disciples, are they supposed to memorize on the spot everything? And the thing is, Jesus repeats his teaching. All four Gospels tell us he repeats his teaching. So every single Gospel has Jesus repeating something within that Gospel, okay? So he says things again and again. And what I take to be going on in, say, Matthew 5 to 7, the Sermon on the Mount, the Lesson on the Mount, is a summary of the teaching. I think Jesus also, if you come up with something as cool as the Beatitudes, use it more than once. If you come up with something as cool as this story, use it more than once. But at the same time, the story works best if it's told to exactly the group that Luke said it's told to. Because if it doesn't have the Bible experts in there, why on the Bible expert references, if you like? So what I've come to is Jesus is an itinerant speaker. He reuses material, he adapts it. And often what we think in the Gospels is there's a lot of summarizing going on. We can be worried why in Matthew it says, blessed are the poor in spirit, and in Luke it says, blessed are you poor, and we wonder which did he say. But we don't have the same angst when we read John's Gospel, and we read him saying, I am the door, and I am the door of the sheep. Or, I am the vine, and I am the true vine. We accept that he could have said both, because it actually has in the same discourse, he says both. So what I think happens is, we get things called a synopsis, where we lay things out in parallel, and we assume that where we get a match between the two Gospels, we're getting actually the same moments. Whereas you may be getting 2 minutes later in one Gospel, and 2 minutes earlier in another. So I think there's a lot of summarizing that goes on. Then, as I talked about evils of the question mark, and how it messes your brain, these evil things are called speech marks have come into Bibles in the last 100 years, really, and they mess up our brain because we have particular expectations with quotation. Namely, between these speech marks, you don't omit anything without a ... You don't add anything, right? Now, problem is, that's completely anachronistic for dealing with the time of Jesus, because nowadays, if someone says 20 words and I can only remember 15 of them, there are two correct procedures, either to do a really complicated thing with ... or to completely rephrase and hide any of the vocabulary so I'm not plagiarizing. And those are my two moral options, right? Well, what if you lived in a society where there are other options? For instance, just putting in the words you can remember. So that's why I think that there's a very thick bandwidth going from Jesus to the Gospels. I don't think it just comes through a thin thread, but also there are are there are these things like question marks, speech marks, which mess up our minds. Now, there's a great question, but there's a great lunch as well.